Greetings, everybody. It's Jim. When I did the video a few days ago about why everybody should be using GURPS, I mean, man, it took off like a rocket. And not just the videos, but the discussions online. I mean, there's no shortage of opinions, that's for sure. Both good and bad. Most of it's positive, though. But the thing is, this video is going to be a number of videos I'm going to do about GURPS. But this video is going to be the easiest one for me to do because it's about the original reason why I really wanted to get this book in the first place is because I am a big fan, if you haven't already known, about GURPS' older brother, The Fantasy Trip, which is also made by Steve Jackson Games. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson about that, but it's basically about, taking ideas from GURPS, which is the more detailed game, and bringing some of those ideas into The Fantasy Trip, which is a little bit more of a broader game, a little bit quicker, a little bit easier to get into, still very detailed. It still feels very good, the combat system and everything like that. But some of these ideas will work, some of them won't. And even if they do work, maybe you shouldn't use them in the first place. So maybe I can save you some time here. So today, I'm going to be going over with you about how you can be stealing from GURPS for the Fantasy Trip role-playing game. The first thing that comes to mind when taking something from GURPS is about skills and how they're increased. Nothing's wrong with the Fantasy Trip version, it just doesn't lead to a little bit of granularity. As we all know, somebody's a swordsman, and they can be a swordsman with an IQ of 8 because it doesn't matter. But if they want to be a better swordsman, there's only two ways to do it. One, get the weapon expertise skill. The problem with that is you need an IQ of an 11. And if you're already at IQ 11, that's okay, but if you're at an IQ 8, it's going to take you a long time to get there, then you got to buy the skill on top of it. Not very effective. So the best way is to usually just increase your dexterity, which is fine. The only problem is the second you're a good swordsman or a great swordsman, now all of a sudden you can juggle 5 balls while on a tightrope as well, right? It seems like you can do everything with a great amount of dexterity, and that's what happens when you raise attributes. So the idea of GURPS, though, is being able to raise a skill without raising the attribute, and that's what you see the chart over here they allow you to do. So here's the skill cost level for GURPS, and basically what you do is you figure out what you want your final skill level to be for whatever skill you have. So for instance, we have a swordsman. He's a dexterity of 12. We want it to be 16. So we want it to be the attribute that we have plus 4. So we go to the left-hand column, we go to attribute plus 4, and then we cross-reference it with the difficulty of the skill. Now for a sword, it's considered an average skill. Okay, so we cross-reference attribute plus 4 plus average, and then we have 16. So it costs in GURPS 16 points to get that skill. So basically we'll have a guy with a dexterity of 12, which ain't too shabby, but now he's a really good swordsman without being able to do all kinds of acrobatic flips by default. So there's two ways to implement this that I see in the Fantasy Trip. One of them being very simple. It's just saying, hey, look, whatever you need for your next point, if you give me a third of those experience points, I'll let you get your skill that you want up by 1 point in that. Just for that skill, though, not across the board, right? That would be easy. And you could modify that, whether it's an easy skill or a very hard skill like they do here. You could say, hey, if it's a skill of 13 or 14 IQ, it's going to cost you half. Or if it's a very easy skill, okay, I'll do it for maybe a fourth, etc., etc. The second way is to just really modify this chart, and it would take some finagling because basically you don't want it to get abused, but I'm sure it could be done, and just say, hey, this is what it would cost in experience points to go up in one specific skill. So I'm going to go back to this picture here that I showed you at the beginning of this segment because this is actually from the 3rd edition. I went back to the 4th edition skill charts because of the idea that it was just easier to explain. And that actually is the point here of where I think I'm going with this, because here on the top here, basically they divide skills into 2 different sections here in the 3rd edition. The top one is for physical skills, mainly off of dexterity, and on the bottom is mental skills based on IQ. And now look at the average column there. The average one actually goes up for physical skills by 8 points each level after a while, and on the bottom, mental skills only go up by 2 each level after a while. Now, of course, this is one of the reasons why I like 3rd edition actually, as compared to the 4th edition. But at the same time, when thinking about the Fantasy Trip, it really brings out that this has got a lot of detail. And yeah, I want to solve a problem. of what I just said, a guy that's raising his swordsmanship, but all of a sudden can find himself walking on a tightrope and juggling. We don't want that. So what's the best way to solve it without getting too detailed? Because that's the best solution. The easiest solution for the fantasy trip is the best solution. So the best solution to me is just taking a third of your experience that you need and saying, I will give you that bonus for that skill only. I think that's the way I would go. What do you think? Shields are pretty interesting. In the fantasy trip, if you have a shield, it only offers you protection in the front hexes. In GURPS, they give you one extra hex as one of your side hexes, depending on which hand you hold the shield in. Okay, this is easily implemented in the fantasy trip if you want to. In GURPS, you can only use a shield once per turn, okay? And that's something you can actually use in the fantasy trip. There are a few things that you got to think through first, though, because some questions will arise. The first thing is to understand the differences in the system. In GURPS, to use a shield, when you get hit, you actually have a shield skill, and you roll that or less, and then you block the hit. Simple enough. Now, in the fantasy trip, they don't have that system. Basically, it's, as we know, it's just more straightforward. It's a damage resistance bonus, right? But all you have to do is say, hey, you only get that bonus once per turn. So two questions arise with this, though. One of them is the idea of the time difference between GURPS and Fantasy Trip. GURPS uses 1 second turns, and Fantasy Trip uses 5 second turns. Now, the idea is, in the Fantasy Trip, you're saying, wait a minute, you can only say I can block once per turn? Well, it's 5 seconds. I could easily block more than once a turn. But we have to remember that, Fantasy Trip is kind of combining a whole bunch of attacks at once, right? That's just like D&D says. Because it is 5 seconds. While GURPS, it is 1 attack per second or 1 block per second. And the idea of doing it in the fantasy trip is just a simulation of all of them happening at once. So when you're getting attacked by 2 defenders and you're blocking one and not getting the bonus on the other, it's still showing the idea of being overwhelmed. Now, the second question, what about shield expertise, got a little tricky, but as always, the answer lies in, for the fantasy trip, when trying to convert something, use the most efficient path possible, okay? You want more detail, but you don't want complication. So, there's 2 bonuses when you use shield expertise. You get a bonus to your damage resistance, and of course, that's easy enough. You just stack it on and to what you already have, and you still only get to use that once a turn. Okay, simple. But what about the -1 that the other guy has to hit you? Okay, that one takes a place across the board. Don't change that. Everybody trying to hit you is at -1. It's just when they do hit you, then you only get that damage resistance of 1. And the reason that is, and you only get to use it once, is because I foresee a problem with constantly having to declare when you're using that shield bonus or that shield expertise to get the -1. And of course, once you declare it and the guy misses, well, you also have now lost your damage resistance for the turn as well. Okay, so that doesn't seem like would work. Pairing is a little bit more difficult because, I would love to see something about pairing in the fantasy trip because they don't have one. Really, if you try to do the defend maneuver, you don't attack back. And that's okay when you're playing most of the battles that, you're playing with 4 guys aside generally. So yeah, if you're in a tight situation or something like you're hurt, you can defend and let the other guys, hopefully they'll make quick work of the opposition and come help you. Or there might be some tactical reasons, like you're a tank or something like that, and you go up there, you start swinging and defending while everybody else tries to do an end run around the other guy, and that can happen. However, if you're on a 2-on-2 or 1-on-1 situation, even worse, if you already get to the point where you're defending and you're not attacking back, you've already lost. You're just waiting for the other guy to roll good. Right? So I would like something there. Now, the thing is, in GURPS, you can only defend with a parry once per turn. But unlike a shield, in Fantasy Trip, at least a shield has some bonuses that you could say that you can only use once a turn. Other than losing the attack itself, which is the problem when you're trying to defend it in the Fantasy Trip, there's nothing situational to say, well, you'll lose a certain bonus. So, let's make one up. The only thing I could think of is like a semi-defense maneuver, okay, where you give the other guy a -1 to hit you, but you get a -2 to hit him, or it's a -2. That would probably be, it's like half of an all-out defense, a -2 to get hit and a -4 to hit them back. It's not much, and it would benefit guys with high dexterities mainly, but at the same time, at least it gives you something and some hope that you could pull something off. Advantages and disadvantages are basically innate abilities that, don't go off of an attribute, or you don't roll for like a skill generally. It's just something that's part of the character, And in GURPS, if you have an advantage, it costs you points. If it's a disadvantage, it gives you points. So you can spend more or take away from your character, right? Now, the thing is, I usually give GURPS all the credit in the world for saying, hey, they were the first ones to come out with this idea. But as I do more research, I find out that's actually not true. It was the first role-playing game to come out officially and say it, but the DNA of all these ideas were already back in the fantasy trip. So they actually had advantages and disadvantages. They weren't called as such. So disadvantages, to find them, you actually have to go to the Fantasy Trip Compendium, where they have the interplay articles and the Space Gamer articles that talk about handicaps. It's their version of disadvantages. So basically, you could say your character's blind, or they got one arm, or they got a limp, or something like that. And that would give you, depending on the severity, a couple more skill points to spend on your character, right? Now, as far as advantages, they didn't really have any per se, but some of them were already in the fantasy trip, like for instance, acute hearing. Acute hearing in GURPS is considered an advantage. In the fantasy trip, it's considered a talent. All right, so it's at IQ 8. Now, you might have to experiment whether the IQ levels really matter for an advantage or disadvantage or anything like that. Maybe some of them might apply, but for the most part, you could just say people can have them. And the thing is about advantages and disadvantages, they work on points, when you're reading them, they work on usually points of multiples of 5. 5, 10, and 15 usually, right? So I would say just by default, a 5-point advantage or disadvantage would be the equivalent to one talent point in the fantasy trip. Okay, and if there is a skill that tells you it's 2 points a level, like in acute hearing, that gives you a +1 bonus for each level, just buy it up to to the point where it's in multiples of 5, and you just use that. That's the way I would use advantages and disadvantages for the fantasy trip. So one more thing about advantages and disadvantages. One of the reasons I think you'll end up, a lot of you would really do well to get the 3rd edition of GURPS is because even though this covers a lot of other genres, the advantages and disadvantages really are pretty generic. Even throughout the ones, there are a few that you won't use because of space or anything like that, but there's not that many. Okay, unlike the 4th edition, which really seems like they have some esoteric stuff out there. Now, granted, this is one of the reasons why they came out with Dungeon Fantasy, which is GURPS just fantasy, and then that's probably even better to a degree. However, if you do plan on ever, really pushing the limits and going to a modern campaign or a space campaign within your campaign, I'm thinking, your version of Expedition to the Barrier Peaks kind of thing, where there's a little sci-fi involved. And let's face it, Seedry definitely has its sci-fi elements, so I really think that this book would do you fine in that regard. So the advantages and disadvantages, there's a few you won't use, but for the most part, they're all good in here. So here's an idea that we can take from GURPS from the injury portion of the book. As we know, with the fantasy trip, if you take 8 points or more of damage, whether it be from one source or multiple sources, you go down without a fight, right? With GURPS, what they say is if you take if half of your strength in damage, then you make a strength check. If you fail, you're okay. If not, then you go prone. Okay, and we can take this idea and go one step further with the fantasy trip. We can go back to that 8-point example where you can get from multiple sources, and we could still call it 8 if we wanted to. But to go along with the percentage idea, since 8 is, you can do 80% because 8 is 80% of 10, right? And that's probably based on your average guy. You could say 75, 80, whatever works. Now, if it's one thing we take from GURPS Magic, it's going to be the spells, right? Now, the thing is, in 3rd edition and 4th edition books, there's just about as many spells in those books as there is in the fantasy trip, right? And it's just, and if you know the fantasy trip, it's just a small amount. It's a very limited number. I mean, there's enough to go around and do things, but at the same time, it's not this encyclopedia of spells. Not that GURPS doesn't have that. It definitely has books that will give you spells the live long day. But the thing is, by using the spells in the main books, it'll be just enough. And there is a little bit of overlap of some spells from the fantasy trip to GURPS, but there's a lot that are different enough too, especially like the elements, because fire is the main element in the fantasy trip, and I kind of like that, having its own special thing. But at the same time, if you actually wanted to have spells for the other three elements, earth, wind, and fire, or no, earth, wind, and water, you can have that in there. And there's a few others, and a few other novelty spells as well. It's just a good smattering of things that can give you another piece of flavor for your fantasy trip campaign. Now, both systems use a different type of categorization to elicit spells. So, they both use missile spells, but GURPS uses area effect spells, information spells, and the fantasy trip uses creation spells, right? They have their own little thing. Now, you can take from those, from magic. And the only reason you would use these for, of course, is if you have a magic item that modifies a certain type of spell, or you give somebody the ability to, if they cast area spells, they get a bonus something or other. But the thing is, the only thing you'd have to do if you want to bring any of these over, these categories, is to actually go through all your spells for the fantasy trip and say what they would be. And it's just going to take a little work. It can be done, though. So when it comes to special powers, it's really going to be coming up to you as a game master to determine how much that's worth, and if you want to give it to somebody. And this might be out of the scale of In the Labyrinth to do something really super powerful. The thing is about the GURPS system, especially the 4th edition, is they go over psionics, for instance, and psionics is pretty much learning how to do powers in the first place. But they only give you 4 pages of stuff, while in this book they give you about good 9 to 10, which covers every kind of category pretty much of psionics. Mind you, 4th edition has, its own book of psionics, but for the most part, again, this is so complete that if this is all you ever ran and you only did psionics every so often, this would be more than enough. Now, the thing is, how they figure out points in GURPS is basically there's two categories. It's like a power level and a control level. I'm paraphrasing here, but the idea is you have 2 stats. Basically, power is how much, like if you wanted telekinesis, you can move things. If you only have a power of 1, you can move a nickel. If you have a power of 20, you can move a car, right? And then there's the control. Okay, so a power of 1, you can't control it at all, and you're very clumsy. And of course, a level of 20, you can maneuver it around a rat's maze and just come out the other end. That's all it means. Now, the thing is, as far as points go, again, maybe you could just do it like advantages and disadvantages. Every 5 points costs a skill. But of course, when it comes to psionics, that could mean a lot. Your character may only be a one-note Johnny and just say, hey, look, I can set things aflame, and I know how to cook. They'd get that pretty expensive. But then again, we are talking GURPS here, which, it's trying to make a little bit of everything for any kind of campaign. So in the fantasy trip, you might find yourself, maybe if you have special powers, you really have to tone it down, or just say, that's just the way it is with the character and not worry about points at all. I thought that doing weapons for GURPS to the fantasy trip would be a lot more complicated, and it did take a little bit of thinking here and there, but let me just give you an example of one of the things that I definitely think can be used, sparingly, mind you, and that is the idea of separating crushing, cutting, and impaling weapons, okay? Basically, in GURPS, it works like this. If you have a crushing weapon, like a mace or something, it just does normal damage. But a cutting weapon, once it gets through armor, will do half a 50% bonus damage. And an impaling weapon, as we all know, they generally don't do a lot of damage up front, but if they do manage to get through the armor, then they do double damage. Okay, now the thing is, you can't just directly port that over into the fantasy trip. Why is that? Because in the differences of how characters die. In the fantasy trip, if you hit 0, you're dead. That's it. In GURPS, however, you don't start rolling for death until you hit negative your health points. So if you're a regular guy with a health of 10, you don't start rolling until you are at negative 10. So technically, they get double the amount of hit points that you would in the fantasy trip. Now you could say, well, why don't we just modify it like that? If it's double, then all we have to do is say an impaling weapon is a 50% bonus, not double bonus. And then a slashing weapon or a cutting weapon like a sword, instead of giving them a 50% bonus, would be a 25% bonus. And I guess that'd be easy enough. So I think with those modifications, the fantasy trip could easily use it, but I think it would even be better served if you just kept it for certain situations instead of regular combat between humans. One would be, an example would be a skeleton, okay? As we know in the fantasy trip, if you do 8 points in one blow to a skeleton, it just crushes, right? And the idea is pretty sound, but let's consider this. A crushing weapon like a baseball bat or a mace will do double damage, because you can just imagine that just crushing through all those bones, while a cutting weapon or like a sword would just do normal damage. While an impaling weapon, you could easily say, because how's it, it's just bones, you're going through it, how is that really going to do any damage? You could even say the skeleton is impervious to impaling weapons. That's an idea that I think would work well. Another little nitpick that I think would be very, very useful is also to call cutting damage slashing damage instead of cutting damage. Why is that? Well, cutting and crushing both start with the same letter. So as you can see on the chart here, this is from GURPS. On the right, it says cut, impale, and then on the bottom it says crushing. I mean, you have to use 3 letters because of it. It would be just easier to just say S, C, and I for slashing, crushing, and impaling. Simple enough. So in true fantasy trip form, we got to try to keep things as simple as possible, right? If you look at the GURPS books, as far as their damage types, it's all over the place. They run the gamut, everything. I mean, most swords do 2 types of damage. So if you're slashing or if you're slashing with it, that's cutting damage. If you're thrusting with it, it's impaling damage. And there's a lot of that going on in GURPS. We don't want to do that in the fantasy trip. So the best way is just to assign every category of weapon the category of damage that it does. There's caveats to this, I understand, but let's just go through the basics. Knives and swords would be cutting damage, or what I like to call it, slashing damage. Axes, maces, and hammers would be crushing damage. And then, of course, missile weapons and pole weapons would be impaling damage. Now, also, with the impaling damage would be fencing weapons like the rapier or the saber, probably. Well, the saber would be slashing, but see, again, we're getting into that little nitpick there. But it doesn't matter because, again, that's why I wanted to keep it situational against certain monsters. So it doesn't really matter all that much except for every so often. If you start doing that with regular humans and stuff like that, then it becomes I think a thing where some weapons will be more favored than others. Okay, while it would just be a bonus in other places just for flavor. But anyway, axes would be another one that people would think of as like, Jim, that's got an edge on it. That's a cutting weapon. Well, the thing is, I'm thinking about the chop, right? I'm thinking about the head of the axe being heavy, just like a mace is heavy at the end. Wham! That's what I'm thinking. So that's why it's more crushing than cutting, So that's the idea there of what I'm going through. And I think that would actually work pretty well. Now, here's something I don't recommend the fantasy trip using, and that is the idea of basic speed and move. Now, basic speed in GURPS, it's really tempting to use because it's almost like a little bit of a tiebreaker because they use basic speed to determine who goes first. And it gets a little bit more granular, and there's basically what they do is they take their dexterity plus their health, and then they divide it by 4. And you get a number like this, like in basic speed here for this character, 7.125, okay? So basically, a little bit of granularity. But that's okay when you're playing maybe 2 characters aside, like GURPS is pretty much, that's the scale that I think it plays at. While in the Labyrinth, or the fantasy trip, if you will, plays more teams of 4 to 6, where, that's nice and everything, but that can actually bog things down. It's just quicker to just go by dexterity. Another thing is the idea of movement. The movement in GURPS is the basic speed minus the encumbrance, and this character's got an encumbrance of 1, and then you chop off the any fractions, so you get a basic of 6. Now the thing is here, the difference between GURPS using 1 second turns and 3 feet hexes, while the fantasy trip uses 5 second turns and 4 feet hexes. Okay, so basically we got a character here with a movement of 6, they can move 6 hexes a turn, and at 3 feet, that's 18 feet a turn. Now, if you actually took that into the fantasy trip for their 5-second turn, for 5 seconds, and extended that, they can go 90 feet in 5 seconds. Now, take example to a character that's really blazing fast in the fantasy trip with a speed of 12. Okay, even with 4 feet a hex. In a 5, remember it's a 5-second turn, so 12 times 14 is 48. They're going half as fast as the guys in GURPS. So it doesn't really translate well. I'm sure you could do a lot of fandangling and stuff like that, but and it's always tempting to say, okay, you're straight, and we would actually use strength plus dexterity divided by 4, and or a different number. But then you'd have your strong guys getting a more of a edge. Even over regular, weaker, quick guys, which we don't want. So we really want to keep the dexterity for, who goes first, and just movement as that is standard. So one thing we can definitely learn from this, whether it's taking ideas from GURPS or anything else for that matter and bringing them into the fantasy trip, just remember to keep it as simple as possible. It's not always possible, but if you can do it, do it. And make sure that payoff, if you are going the extra length to have some detail, there is a payoff, or at least just make it situational. One of the things that comes to mind is the fencing rules that was in Hexagram a few issues ago. Basically, just against fencer, and they add a little bit of rules in there to make a little bit more flavor, a little bit of arrow flint, a little bit of hanging off the chandeliers gameplay, and that's cool. But you wouldn't want to use it all the time against regular swordsmen and such like that. Just keep it to fencers against fencers, and that'd be fine. Then you have all your swashbuckling glory. Anyway, guys, I do have the cards that have already come in for Dungeon Runner, my card game. The cards are already in, and I've already for all 5 decks, and I'm just going through it, getting one more play test before the Kickstarter ends. By all means, please go over to the Kickstarter and take a look, and make your pledge for Dungeon Runner, and I'll see you guys next video.